Hi, Bruce Emery here from Skeptical Guitarist Publications. I want to do an overview. This is the year 2015, and I want to do an overview of all the books that I have put together so far that I've been marketing since 1997. Just an overview of all the books in case whoever's looking at this has an interest in any aspect of my writing. I began playing guitar when I was 12, after having played baritone uke for a few years. Took classical lessons, went on to study forestry for some reason. Don't ask me why, I can't remember now. And I went on to study forest genetics even, and then decided one day to bail out on all that and teach guitar lessons for a living. So in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I was at the time, I was going to school, I started teaching guitar lessons. Had a great time, really enjoyed it. Taught for about 10 years, and I was sort of looking around for what I needed was a music principles book. I wanted to find a good book on music principles for the guitar, specifically for guitar. And I looked around, couldn't find one. I thought, I think I could write one. I had writing experience. Maybe that was a good thing about going to college and graduate schools. I learned, how to write how to do technical writing. And I said, maybe I'll try it. So in 1996, well, in fact, I decided to do 3 books at once. The Music Principles for the Skeptical Guitarist seemed like a good name. Clearly, I was trying to reach people who are skeptical on a couple of levels. One, skeptical that knowing anything about theory was going to help them with their guitar playing, and also on a level of skeptical that this book would be any better than most of the books I had seen. And I knew that stuff. I understand music theory, and I couldn't read a lot of these books. They were so dense. So it's for the skeptic who says, "Yeah, is this book any better?" Well, I'm saying, yeah, it's for you. I think it is. So I wrote the Music Principles for the Skeptical Guitarist, Volume 1, the big picture first in 96 and 97. And this book tells you, actually the first approach in the book, the first maybe third of the book, is about just taking the chords that the average guitar player knows, C, G, D, A, and E, whatever, and arranging those into keys. Now, I think most people just don't know about this stuff, but they start playing chords, and I think they realize over time, like key or G and C chords, they just seem to work together for some reason, in the same song, and the D chord, but like E, no, that doesn't sound as good with those. Why is that? So for people that have been playing the guitar for a number of years and wonder about that, I said, let me explain that. So I start off in the first approach just organizing, the chords into keys, chord families, and the way to say key. And so I just show, the G chord family, the 1, 4, 5 chords in the G, and then I went on the C chord family and just showed all these different combinations of chords for the same songs over and over. So people can really get a feel for how it works. That was the first approach. And then I went back to the beginning and said, now let's go back to the chromatic scale, which is just all the notes. Let's go back to the chromatic scale and let's derive major scales from the chromatic scales. And then we can derive the chords that belong to each of those scales. And there's a technique, and I go over to the book, and I give worksheets too. So you can go through and you can, figure these things out, work them, write them out yourself. It's good for you to write it out. You'll believe it if you see it happening with your own eyes under your own pencil, So organize these keys, derive the chords from the keys, triads, and then, try to organize the keys themselves into the circle of fifths. And people have heard the circle of fifths for years, and some of the books I saw, they start off page 1, circle of fifths. Well, that's the best way to alienate people I've ever imagined. I don't show them the circle of fifths until about page 100 in the book. I'll show you. I explain up to that point everything you need to know, so that when you then finally look at that, you go, Oh yeah, that all makes perfect sense. I understand all of that because all the pieces, the components, have already been explained to you. You know. So from that point on, how do you use a circle of fifths? Well, so much of our music is organized around the circle of fifths, you know, and I have lots of examples, Christmas tunes, whatever it takes, you know, common music that people know. I talk about the minor keys a little bit too, and that's pretty much where that book goes. I think it's been you know, it was popular right away. People liked it. Volume 2 is, I'll show you this one. Volume 2 is called the Fretboard, and the information that's in this book is really, most of it's more appropriate for just a guitarist. The information in that first book, The Big Picture, that information applies to all music. It's just that the guitar is the example in that book. But book 2 says, now that you know all these music principles from book 1, where do you find them on the neck of the guitar? Where are the chords and the scales that can express the general music principles that you learned in book 1? And so this book starts off talking about chord voicings, your ranges of notes in chords. We talk about this caged concept where C, A, G, E, and D are the 5 most common guitar chords because of the open strings that we have on the guitar. And so we look at those keys, and then it turns out that each of those chords, C, A, G, E, and D, is also a shape of notes. If you see a C chord, you recognize its shape, but all of these shapes can be moved around the neck of the guitar, either with a capo or with a bar or some other way. And so there are the chords, and then there are chord shapes. So there's like a C chord and a C chord shape, and you move up the neck, you'll find an A shape of a C chord and a G shape of a C chord. So I wanted to explain all that. And then, of course, each of these chord shapes has a scale associated with it. So the latter half of this book goes through those scales, you know, scale positions, scale shapes around the neck. And finally, at the end of this book, I talk about like chord qualities, you know, diminished chord, diminished 7 augmented, minor 7 flat 5, minor major 7 13th chords, and all that. So you get a pretty, that's information that's also useful to other instruments than the guitar. But I've got it for the guitar, the best shapes and voicings of those. Okay, volume 3, I wrote that probably in '99, and volume 3 was, in its basic form, was a disaster, because volume 3 was called, you know, volume 3 Music Principles, Blues and Jazz. Well, so I had this, the first half was blues and the second half was jazz, and it didn't really sell very, it never had sold very well. It took me a couple of years to figure this out. I realized, you know, people that are going to want to learn to play blues don't necessarily want to play jazz, and vice versa. And I think that's part of what, so I said, well, I'm gonna split them up. So I had a volume 3, but then a few years later I decided to split them into blues guitar from scratch and jazz for the skeptical guitarist. Jazz really makes a lot more use of the music principles and the theory that was discussed in the first 2 books. Blues is actually not very theoretical. There are a couple things you should know, but then it's mostly just getting out there and playing the scale. So the blues book starts off 12-bar blues, how to accompany the 12-bar blues in the keys of E and A, and those are the most common ones. And you know, playing down the neck of the guitar mostly. The pentatonic scales then are presented, and that first E minor pentatonic scale shape, give that, you work you through that, all kinds of exercises, find, you know, the flatted thirds and fifths and flatted sevenths, whatever's in that scale, you know. And then I said, well, now let's take this whole thing up the neck, put it on the road, and put it into the key of A. All of those positions can be brought up to the 5th fret, starting at the 5th fret, and I run through all of those licks again so you can see how you move them up the neck and move them around. And again, there are the scale, well, in this book I call them box patterns. So there's the E minor box pattern, that's the most common one. There's a G minor box pattern, there's a D minor, A minor, C minor box patterns. And I show how those lay down and how you can travel from one to the next. When you see these blues players shooting around the neck of the guitar, they're just going from one box pattern to the next. better than I can, but anyway, that's what they're up to. At the end of this book, there's a little bit about slide guitar as well, which I had not had in the original volume 3 of the music principles when I had it. So I added some about slide, and also about the major pentatonic scale, which is related to the minor pentatonic scale, maybe obviously. So that's been a pretty popular book. The jazz book really starts off at the end of where volume 2 was, and says, well, let's take this popular rhythm changes progression, and let's find every way to play it on the neck of the guitar. And jazz chords, this is the actual application of all those diminished and augmented and minor 7 flat 5 chords. How do you use them using again the circle of fifths, which turns out to be, it's a scary concept at first, but once you've seen how the circle gets used, it's a real comfort to have. It really helps you out of a lot of jams, and helps you figure out songs if you're just listening to some jazz standard, and you can just, well, maybe the next chord is down a fifth from the one I'm playing out, and by golly, a lot of times it sure is. Anyway, so this book brings you to all those different combinations of chords and progressions, and then at the end it goes into the modes. Mixolydian mode, Dorian mode, explains that, and shows you how to use those to play, to improvise jazz lead lines. Okay, so that's the last half of the jazz book. Okay, so that was really volume 3, Music Principles, split into 2 books. So I began hearing from people saying that, that Music Principles book is a good book, but I don't know how to play it, but I'm just a beginner, and it's too advanced for me, or I can use it, but it's really high, it's not hard. And I'm thinking to myself, well, it's really not meant as a beginner's book. So maybe there's a demand for a beginning guitar book. I don't know. I thought not, but apparently there was, because I wrote Guitar from Scratch the next year, and this has been my best-selling book until I wrote the ukulele book just a couple of years ago. The Guitar from Scratch is for the beginners, and it starts from scratch. So it's a whole line of books that it takes those concepts of the 1-4-5 and all that, explains it in a little more depth, but it also explains how to transition from chord to chord the best way, which that first book didn't do. I didn't talk about put this finger here and that finger there and make this your transition, and you have an anchor finger and a guide finger, and I didn't do that. I just showed, hey, this is what you do with those chords. So this book is more technique. A lot of people say, what's the difference between that and the Music Principles Volume 1? Well, it's completely different in that sense. This is about technique. There's a chapter on finger picking, basic finger picking. There are bar chords, there are jazz chords, power chords, suspended chords. Towards the end, various strumming chapters, and towards the end, there is what I call bunches of useful chords, and it's just a little chord dictionary in the back of the book that is helpful for people looking up stuff. So there was that. But this first Guitar from Scratch book is only about chords. There's nothing about single notes in it. And I decided, well, okay, that was popular, so why don't I go on and write the Guitar from Scratch, the sequel. And here is where, at the beginning, I thought I would put what I call stupid chord tricks, just little things that are not particularly very theoretical, but people enjoy adding a note here or doing some little. It's like the quirks and the idioms of playing the guitar. Like if you have a C chord and you move it up 2 frets, what is that? It's just. It turns out that it's a D type of chord. I don't know that most people think about that when they make it, or why that is. But I discuss chords like that, movable little shapes, something on the neck, and then we start creeping in with the individual notes, single notes as parts of bass lines. Bum 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 bum. How that fits in, and then it's okay. Let's go ahead and look at scales and single line notes, and particularly emphasizing the alternating picking, down, up, down, up, down, up with the pick, trying to keep that rhythm going with your arm. And I would say that playing major scales is not all that fascinating at at first when you're first playing the guitar, but the blues scale is. So I take a little bit of, I do some blues, just enough to get people warmed up, a little bit of minor pentatonic, and then the major pentatonic. And I think that's the fun way to practice notes. Now, then, starting about, what, page 50 something, about more than halfway through the book, I teach standard music notation. Now, I'm not a big proponent of learning that right away when you're playing the guitar. I think it can get in the way. I think the notation can be a problem. But everyone should kind of know, you should be able to read the notes on the staff. So I spent some time with some nice big note heads and nice big staves, teaching you how to find these notes, ledger lines above and below the staff, and what they're called. I lots of examples, We Three Kings, Dixie, whatever, you name it. And that winds up the Guitar from Scratch. The sequel. I think this book is at least as valuable as the first book is. But as a sequel, it doesn't generate a lot of excitement, just the name sequel. But when people get it, I think they realize, yeah, this is the next place you need to go. Now, I like finger picking and took classical lessons in college. In high school. Didn't do anything in college, went off to do forestry. Fingerstyle Guitar from Scratch is next. It shows the arpeggio style of playing, a little bit of classical stuff in it. And then about halfway through, it changed to the Travis style, the finger picking style with the thumb and alternating bass. The arpeggio style just being something like this, and Travis style being more like this. So the first half of the book shows arpeggio style, and the second half is all Travis style. It's all vocal accompaniment. There's no melody being included in any of these arpeggios. That happens in the next book I wrote, which is Travis style Guitar from Scratch. This differs from the fingerstyle because it's all alternating bass, and the point of it is to establish an alternating bass and add a melody to it. So, very different from the accompaniment approach. The idea is to create this independence between this half of your hand and this half of your hand, so that everything you do with your fingers, the thumb doesn't mind. It just keeps playing it keeps doing its job, playing its bass line, and you challenge it with the things that the fingers do. Okay, so actually that book takes about half a dozen different tunes, Camptown Ladies, things like that, and plays them at 4 different levels of difficulty. So you start off with a very basic, vanilla flavored version, but then when I teach you about syncopation, then the next version will have some syncopation. When I teach you about bass runs, the next version will have bass runs. So it's a nice progressive thing to go through. You run through this half dozen tunes 4 times, each time improving on it. Okay, then, hey, it's Christmas, right? I've had Christmas arrangements for years. Christmas fingerstyle guitar, and this book, kind of like that Travis book, it takes each Christmas carol, there's like 18 or 19 of them, takes each one and does it at 3 different levels, beginning right in a row. Angels Leave Heard on High, level 1, 2, and 3, and you can begin learning, stop wherever you feel uncomfortable going any farther. So that's been a valuable book for me. I use it every year when I'm doing my Christmas gigs. Then there's also Christmas Strum-Along Guitar. Well, this has 2 different versions of just vocal accompaniment to standard Christmas carols. Really, all that is. So that's good. And then I wrote Guitar from Scratch Streamlined Edition, aimed at guitar teachers or more advanced students. In my other books, I try to be friendly and do a lot of hand-holding. This is encouraging. This book is kind of just the facts, man. It's kind of streamlined. I pulled out a lot of the extra verbiage that I had in the original Guitar from Scratch book, and because there was more room in the book, I was able to get more into the single note playing and the blues, and also threw in some of the blues information from the Blues Guitar from Scratch. So I think this is a really useful, it's a good framework book for guitar teachers. you may want. I had one guy say, well, he says, there are things that I don't teach, and there's other things that I do teach that you don't have, but it's a good skeleton to go through. It's a good framework to use. Okay, so those are the guitar books. Okay, now we'll leave the guitar behind a little bit, and the next, a guy contacted me and said, have you got a baritone ukulele book? And baritone ukulele was the first instrument I ever played as a kid. I said, well, I should be able to adapt kind of a guitar from scratch to baritone ukulele from scratch. And so that was my next project. And I included a lot of different things. I included some, not only the 1-4-5 steps in the different keys and finger picking, but I did some of this chord melody arrangements as well, where like those Christmas arrangements on the guitar that I have, you have a melody and a bass and some chords that you just sort of throw in between, make a nice arrangement. Did that, and people liked the baritone uke from scratch, but my customers were saying, well, my dealers, my music stores were saying, well, that's a good book. How about regular ukulele? I said, well, okay, that's a little bit of a stretch for me. I hadn't played one really ever, and I said, well, I'm going to get one, and I'm going to see if I can't come up with a book. So I did that, and I based it pretty much on what I'd done in the baritone ukulele book, that same approach on the soprano or concert or tenor uke. And this is that book here. This book has, just in the past couple of years, has taken the lead from the Guitar from Scratch in popularity. It's a very popular book. But it just runs through your basic chords first, gets into playing some blues, finger picking, the general thing that I like to offer for a well-rounded beginner. I think at first there's already 250 ukulele books out there. The thing is, there are not many of them that do what this book does. Most of those books are songbooks, and that's fine to play song after song after song. It's good. It's good for you. But you reach that point. You say, what is this about the G chord and the C chord? Why do they fit together so well? What's going on? And that's what this book answers that question. And so I think of it as being the next. The ukulele fad has been, I don't know how many years now, but this is the next stage in evolution, is this material here. So I want to wrap this up. I've been playing mandolin for a number of years, mandolin from scratch. And this book starts off again with chording and goes into playing individual notes. The mandolin's more of a lead instrument. And I get into the fiddle tunes that it is very, well known to play, Irish and American and Canadian. I get lots of examples of fiddle tunes. Old Joe Clark, Wildwood Flower, you mentioned it. That was the next year, and I said, well, how about the bass guitar? I've got a bass, and I've messed around with it, so that was the next year's project, bass from scratch. And this is probably a little more, it gets more into theory, I think, but it kind of has to. Bass players need to be able to know more about keys, changing keys and scales within keys, so I really introduced that pretty early on in the book, and it's been pretty popular too. And I go through, all the usual circle of fifths and all that. And then I said, well, why not a ukulele Christmas carols and mandolin Christmas carols? Okay, Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night.